Okay, this video is going to cover material in Groundwork Chapter 2. Now I'm actually going to skip around the first 5 pages of Chapter 2, not because it's not important. It is very important, but it's not as relevant to an ethics class, especially an intro level ethics class, because there Kant is focusing a lot on moral epistemology, how we come to know moral truths. This is a very big deal for him. And it actually does shape a lot of what his moral theory looks like. But we've already covered some of it, so I talked about some of that in the preface. He's repeating and extending, repeating points and extending on points that he already made in the preface in the beginning of Chapter 2. And in part, it's an explanation for why he's going to do some things over again in Chapter 2 that happened in Chapter 1. So he derived the formula of universal law in Chapter 1 from, as he said, moral common sense or common moral cognition. And he's going to do it all over again in Chapter 2 because he doesn't actually think the basis for deriving the formula of universal law in Chapter 1 is actually all that sound. He did want to show that you are already implicitly committed to the formula of universal law by deriving it from common moral notions, but he wants to give a better, firmer foundation of it in Chapter 2. But what I'm more interested in, and what I'm more interested in you learning, is not this alternate basis for the formula of universal law. I'm more interested in the other versions of the categorical imperative that come up. And to get what's going on in Chapter 2, we're going to go to a couple of concepts he introduces on about 5 pages in, the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. All right, so what's an imperative? Well, an imperative is a mood that a sentence can be in. A mood can be interrogative, so that would be a question. A sentence can be in the interrogative mood, which means you're using the sentence to ask a question. So if I ask, like, where's the beef? That's a sentence in the interrogative mood. That's what makes it a question. It can be declarative, right? So if I were to say the beef is in the oven, right? Or on the stove, I guess would probably be a better place for the beef. But that would be a declarative sentence. It's a sentence in the declarative mood. An imperative sentence doesn't, as an interrogative does, ask a question. It doesn't state that the world is a certain way, the way a declarative sentence would. What it does is it tells you to do something. Right? And imperatives give commands or advice or recommendations, right? And it's most common to communicate imperatives, or it is common, maybe not most common, but it's common to communicate imperatives by saying something like, you should X, where X is something you should do, or maybe thing you should feel, although Kant's not going to be happy with saying you should feel certain ways. Okay, so that's an imperative. It should be pretty clear morality is concerned with imperatives. Morality is about the way the world ought to be, especially the part of the world that depends on, individual choice. So morality is about imperatives. Which kind of imperatives? Because there are, Kant says, 2 kinds of imperatives. There are hypothetical imperatives, and there are categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are called hypothetical because they have a hypothetical form. So far, Kant's just making sort of grammatical points. A hypothetical imperative says something like, if you want Y, then you should, X. So it's hypothetical just because it's if-then, right? If this is true, then that is true. Hypothetical imperatives connect something you want with some action you should perform. And there's nothing wrong with hypothetical imperatives. In fact, they're central to how we reason about the world, right? How we reason about what to do. If you want this thing, you better do that thing. Lots of your life is built around that. If you want to get a good paying job, then you should go to college. Right? If you want money to spend on things you enjoy, then you should get a good paying job. If you want to go to college, you should study hard in high school. All sorts of things. Right? We've seen this with Aristotle too, right? The way you can connect goods in a sort of hierarchy. One good could be useful only for getting something else. When something has that kind of instrumental value, then when you recommend something with instrumental value, you're going to recommend it via a hypothetical imperative. You're going to say, if you want this thing, if you want to be happy, then you should whatever, right? Not get addicted to heroin. I don't know. Hypothetical imperatives are statements of what is sometimes called instrumental reason or means-end reasoning. Kant wants to make the point that if morality is possible, right, if there's any such thing as moral truth, then there can't only be hypothetical imperatives, because there would have to be just some simple imperatives of this form, a categorical imperative. Why? Well, because hypothetical imperatives don't actually tell you to do something. They don't actually bind you. Kant makes the point that if you don't want y, whatever y is, then the hypothetical imperative doesn't really even apply to you. Right? So let's say I told you if you want to get a good paying job, you should go to college. Well, maybe you don't want a good paying job. If that's the case, then the actual imperative part, the part that actually guides your action or is supposed to guide your action, the part that says you should X, it doesn't apply to you. Right? You get no reason to do anything from it, because its ability to give you any reason to do something is entirely dependent on the antecedent of the hypothetical. And so if you don't satisfy the requirement in the antecedent, if you don't want whatever it is that the antecedent says, is talking about you wanting, then the hypothetical imperative doesn't give you any reason to do anything. Another way of thinking of it is you can escape the command implicit in a hypothetical imperative. You can escape the advice. Just by not wanting to do the thing it talks about. What Kant thinks is that's not what morality is. Morality can't just be telling you how to get what you want. Otherwise, given that people want different things, there would be no moral rules for everybody. There would be no universal objective moral rules. Now, Kant does admit that there is one thing all people want. All people want happiness, their own happiness. But Kant doesn't think that common desire, that common goal, is going to actually be able to provide us with any guidance about how to live our lives, because for different people, happiness will be different things. Right? Happiness isn't the same for all of us. In this way, he's disagreeing pretty significantly with Plato and Aristotle. He shares with Plato and Aristotle the view that everyone pursues their own happiness. But whereas Plato and Aristotle think there are some parts of happiness that are common to everyone because we all have rational natures, Kant thinks, no, happiness is all about what you desire, what you non-rationally desire. And so people just have different non-rational desires. Right? I might like playing video games and you might like playing football. I might like spicy food and you might not like spicy food. We all have different desires. Happiness is just us getting whatever we desire, Kant thinks. So even though we all want happiness, happiness is different for each one of us. So we're not going to get any rules of the hypothetical form that go like, if you want to be happy, then you should do this. There won't be any rules like that. And so there won't be any rules that apply to everyone on the basis of what they desire. And so the only way to get rules that apply to everyone, which Kant thinks is the hallmark of morality, that rules that bind every rational being, the only way to do that is to look for imperatives that aren't hypothetical, that tell you you ought to do something completely independent of what it is you may or may not want. Moral rules, Kant thinks, should guide you towards action independent of any desire you have to live a certain way, to get certain things, right? And he thinks that there really is only one categorical imperative. He's already stated one version of it with the formula of universal law. The reason he thinks this is he thinks, well, it's really hard to understand on what basis you could ever say to someone, you should do this, if the basis isn't desire. What he's going to say is, if it's not desire, it can really only be one thing. If you're not going to base it on what you desire, you're going to have to base it on reason or human rationality. Now that sounds a bit, again, like Plato and Aristotle, for whom the virtues are just based on rationality, what rationality requires of you. But for them, that's all part of your own happiness. And Kant doesn't think that. For Plato and Aristotle, it's because you want to be happy that you want to develop the rational virtues. That's going to be part of the explanation for why it makes sense to want to be virtuous. And for Kant, that plays no role in it. What you want for yourself has nothing to do, Kant thinks, with the moral rules you stand under. And this fact is part of what allows Kant to derive the moral rules he does from just the idea of a categorical imperative. Because if desire can't provide any basis for a categorical imperative, right? So there's no desire you can sort of be commanded to have. What Kant thinks that means is that there can't be any moral law or moral rule telling you to pursue certain goals, right? Telling you to make the world some particular way, right? Because you could think that, here's what morality is about. Morality is about making other people happy. Morality is about making sure people are safe and protected and fed and they have medicine and things like that. You might have some image in your head of what a good society looks like and think, well, morality is about producing that society. And Kant will end up coming to rules that do have things to say about what society should look like. But what Kant thinks is the fundamental moral rule can't be to produce some effect out in the world, to pursue some kind of consequence or some kind of result from your actions. And the reason why Kant thinks that's true is that the only thing that can sort of motivate us to pursue certain results out in the world, certain consequences out in the world, the only thing that can make us want to make the world one way rather than another is desire. Right? If we want the only thing that can give us reason to make the world a certain way is wanting the world to be that way, because fundamentally, nothing out there in the world has any value independent of our desiring it, right? Independent of us wanting it. This is a claim that Kant never really defends much. When we get to chapter 3, we'll see what his view of sort of the world outside of our own heads is, and it'll help to make some sense of this. But Kant fundamentally thinks that there's nothing that's objectively valuable about the world outside of the human mind. Right? So you might think that, like, oh, there's that tree that you see off in the distance, that's beautiful and objectively valuable. Kant will be like, right? You might think that the sound of a songbird singing is, objectively valuable. Kant's going to be like, no. That's not it, right? Things get value from us. Right? Things have value for us because we want them. But it's not like you ought to want those things. It's not like you ought to love the sound of a songbird singing, or you ought to love the beautiful forest or something like that. And this is, again, something of a difference between him and Plato and Aristotle on the other side. Plato and Aristotle both had this category of things that they thought were fine and noble, uh, things that were good and worth pursuing all on their own, and that if you didn't want them, you ought to want them. But Kant doesn't think there's anything you ought to desire. And he thinks desire is the only basis for preferring one thing out in the world over another. And so what that means is the moral law, if it's not based on desire, right, if it's not going to be a set of hypothetical imperatives, if it's going to be a categorical imperative, the moral law can't be directing you out to go do stuff. Right? It can't. The fundamental moral rule can't be something like, as we'll see in the final author of the course, promote human happiness as much as possible. It can't be something like promote peace as much as possible, or promote some sort of traditional social arrangement as much as possible. It can't be anything like that. And so he's led by sort of a similar train of reasoning as in chapter 1 to the idea that really all that's left, if you get rid of all the material objects out in the world as the basis for morality, right? If you say like, well, the fundamental rule can't be to promote some effect, all that's left is the idea of law itself. And so he comes via the idea of a categorical imperative and via the idea of morality being binding on everyone, independent of what they desire, coming back to the idea that the fundamental moral law is just to obey the universal law, right? To act only on maxims that you can will be a universal law. So he's come by a different route to the same point. And all on its own, that wouldn't be so tremendously interesting if you weren't already interested in like Kant's wider views on things. But this way of thinking about what the fundamental moral rules have to be like points us in the direction of something that is very important in Kant. And that's going to be the concept of autonomy. The concept of, here, I'll write it down here. Because the flip side of saying that nothing out there in the world outside of the human mind is of fundamental objective value. The flip side of that is Kant thinks there is something about the human mind, however, that is of fundamental objective value. There is something about us that makes us worthy, not of desire, Kant is going to say, but of respect. And this sets us apart from everything out in the world. And so he's going to find another way, from his perspective anyway, of formulating the fundamental categorical imperative focused on the value of human autonomy. And the next video will explain a little bit more about what human autonomy is supposed to be.